Lorena was finally returning home after spending the last few years on an exchange program in Japan. This journey had been one of her greatest dreams, but to embark on this adventure, she had to make a heartbreaking decision. She left behind her great love, Daniel. Daniel had promised to wait for her until she returned, but Lorena's mother, Donna Esther, convinced her to end the relationship, believing it was a hindrance to her future. Now, 2 years later, Lorena was back in her homeland, her heart pounding as the plane touched down at the airport. She had longed for this moment for months, dreaming of reuniting with her mother's comforting embrace and rekindling the memories of a life she had left behind. However, as she stepped off the plane and looked around, she was overwhelmed by a wave of nostalgia and uncertainty. The familiar air of the city stirred up memories of a past filled with both joy and sorrow, promises made and farewells exchanged, all swirling together in a whirlwind of emotions she still hadn't fully understood. As Lorena navigated through the bustling crowd at the airport, her eyes scanned every face, every movement, searching for something familiar. Standing on the curb, trying in vain to hail a taxi, she suddenly heard a distant voice. Someone among the crowd, a young man begging for alms, holding a child in his arms. Both seemed displaced, vulnerable, and as Lorena looked closer, a shiver ran down her spine. There was something eerily familiar about the way the young man stood. Her heart began to race as she took hesitant steps toward him, her mind clouded with confusion. As she drew closer, their eyes met, and in that instant, Lorena recognized the young man. It was Daniel, the love of her life, standing right before her. Time seemed to freeze as she absorbed every detail of his face. He looked older now, more worn, but there was still a flicker of familiarity in his eyes that sent a pang through Lorena's heart like a punch to the gut. She had made a difficult choice when she left Daniel behind to go to Japan, following her mother's advice and seeking new opportunities beyond the borders of her hometown. But now, all the memories of their happy days together flooded her mind, bringing with them a deep, devastating pain. The silence between them was deafening, heavy with the weight of all the unspoken words and unanswered questions. Lorena wanted to run into Daniel's arms, to scream his name and release all the anguish she had carried with her since she left. But something held her back, keeping her rooted to the spot, silent and trapped in a limbo between the past and the present. As Lorena struggled to find the right words, Daniel looked at her with a mix of sadness and resignation in his eyes. There was so much he wanted to say, so many questions he wanted to ask, but the words seemed to slip away from him like sand through his fingers. Suddenly, Daniel, in a panic, clutched the child tightly and started to run. A whirlwind of emotions enveloped Lorena as she instinctively followed him, her legs moving almost of their own accord in a desperate attempt to catch up. The city streets blurred before her eyes, and the faces of passers-by became indistinct smudges as she chased after Daniel and the child. Her thoughts were in turmoil, a storm of anger, sadness, and worry raging in her mind. As she ran, Lorena tried desperately to make sense of what was happening. Why was Daniel begging on the streets? Where had the dreams they once shared gone? And what had happened to the promises they made when they were young and full of hope? Lorena's breath came in ragged gasps as she continued her pursuit, determined to find out the truth. Footsteps echoed through the now empty streets of the city as Lorena and Daniel drew closer to the climax of their desperate chase. Lorena knew she couldn't let him escape without getting answers, without understanding what had happened to the man she once loved more than anything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel abruptly stopped in front of a plaza. His breathing was ragged, and as he looked back, his eyes were filled with fear and anguish. Lorena approached slowly, her heart still pounding in her chest, and stopped in front of him, unable to utter a word. She placed her hands firmly on Daniel's shoulders, preventing him from running again. Time seemed to stand still around them, the air heavy with a palpable tension, as if the weight of all the years of separation pressed down on them, making it hard to even breathe. She looked into Daniel's eyes, seeing the pain and desperation reflected there, while tears streamed down her face. The child in Daniel's arms began to cry, sensing the tension in the air, and Lorena felt a lump form in her throat. She knew this was the moment to settle all the unresolved issues, to finally face the past and find some way to move forward. Still trying to catch her breath after the frantic chase through the city streets, Lorena didn't know where to begin. The words seemed to escape her, eluding her mind as she struggled to express all the emotions consuming her at that moment. Finally, after a long, tense silence, Lorena found the courage to speak, her voice weak and trembling. "Daniel, it's been so long. Why did you run? Who is this child? What is happening?" She looked at Daniel, desperate for an answer that never came. He remained silent, tears streaming down his face like a river of suppressed emotions. Lorena could feel the pain he was carrying, but she needed to understand what had brought him to this state. "Daniel, please," she implored, her voice shaking with the intensity of her emotions. "You need to tell me what happened. I can't leave here until you tell me the truth." At that moment, a police patrol car pulled up beside them. The officer eyed the situation suspiciously and asked Lorena, "Ma'am, is this young man bothering you? Crime has been on the rise. If you need help, let us know now. It's time this beggar is sent to a shelter and the child taken to Child Protective Services." Hearing this, Lorena panicked. She knew she couldn't let Daniel be taken away without resolving the situation. She looked at the man before her, the man who was once the love of her life, and knew she couldn't abandon him now, not when he needed her most. Indignant at the police's stance and determined to understand the entire situation, Lorena finally responded, "It's all right. This is an old acquaintance of mine, and we're just talking. Please don't worry about us." The officer continued to watch them with suspicion, but after Lorena's response, the patrol finally drove away. In that moment, relief washed over Lorena for a few seconds. The fear of Daniel being taken away and losing the chance to clarify what was happening dominating her thoughts. She knew this conversation was essential, that she needed to understand what had happened between them to finally move on with her life. Lorena, Daniel, and the child stood motionless in front of the plaza, the silence hanging between them like a dense fog. The tension in the air was palpable, and each moment seemed charged with the promise of painful revelations and difficult truths. The police's intervention had only served to heighten the tension further. "Daniel, please tell me what happened," Lorena asked again, her voice soft but firm. "I need to understand. I need to know why you're here, begging on the street with a child in your arms. What happened in these 2 years?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair before finally mustering the courage to speak. He invited Lorena to sit on a nearby bench. "I need to sit down and calm myself before I can tell you everything. Things have been hard, Lorena," he whispered, his voice hoarse, each word laden with the pain of the fate that had befallen him over the years. As they settled on the bench, Lorena felt the urgency to address the issue that had been troubling her so deeply. "My mother told me about your ex-wife's pregnancy," she began, searching for any reaction from Daniel. She hoped for an explanation that could justify what had happened during her absence. Every word seemed heavy, burdened with years of accumulated doubts and resentment. She watched Daniel closely, looking for any sign that might help her understand the situation. Daniel let out a bitter sigh before responding. "Your mother told you everything, didn't she? You stopped communicating with me, Lorena. You didn't even bother to call and ask what was happening. You just believed everything your mother said, didn't you?" His words carried a deep pain and an accusation that Lorena couldn't ignore. She was confronted with the possibility that she had misjudged the situation, influenced by the incomplete and biased information from her mother, who had always been against her relationship with Daniel. Each word from him seemed to pierce her heart, making her question every decision she had made since leaving for Japan. "Daniel, then, Daniel continued, his voice heavy with regret. If only you knew what really happened. I don't know if I have the strength to keep going. It's so hard to see you doing well when my life has fallen apart. I begged your mother to give me your new contact in Japan, but she told me you had nothing to say to me. A wave of regret and a sense of injustice washed over Lorena. She realized that not only had she allowed her mother's words to drive a wedge between her and Daniel, but she had also let fear and uncertainty cloud her judgment. I'm so sorry, Daniel, she murmured, her voice breaking under the weight of the tears threatening to spill. I shouldn't have believed everything she said. I should have given you the chance to tell me your side of the story. Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with sadness and pain. I understand, Lorena, he said softly, but we can't change the past now. We need to try and understand what happened and move forward the best we can. Lorena nodded, knowing Daniel was right. She couldn't turn back time or undo the decision she had made, but she could learn from her mistakes and try to repair what was still possible. As they sat in the plaza, the sun began to set on the horizon, and Lorena felt a glimmer of hope spark in her heart. She knew this conversation would be difficult, but she was also eager to finally uncover what had happened during the years she had been away. However, as the thought of Daniel being involved with another woman crossed her mind, a sudden surge of anger flared in her chest. Despite her mother's encouragement to leave the relationship behind and focus on her future, Lorena had never stopped loving Daniel. He had been the great love of her life. Struggling to keep her emotions in check, Lorena let her anger slip through. You got another woman pregnant? Daniel? Did I mean so little to you that you just replaced me while I was on the other side of the world, thinking of you every day? Her words were laced with a pain she had never imagined facing, her voice trembling with the confusion and longing to understand the truth. Daniel could see the sincerity in Lorena's eyes, and the weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew he couldn't keep postponing the truth any longer. He had to explain everything, even if it meant reliving the most painful moments of his life. He took a deep breath, gathering the courage to confront what lay ahead. Lorena, I never wanted to hurt you, he began, his voice trembling with the intensity of his emotions. When you left for Japan, I felt lost. I missed you every day, and the loneliness was overwhelming. I never replaced you. You have to understand that. Lorena listened intently, her hands trembling as she fought to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. She wanted to believe Daniel's words, to find a way to forgive him. But the pain of that moment was still fresh in her mind, like a blade cutting deep into her heart. I was still trying to recover from the end of our relationship and your departure to Japan, Daniel continued, his voice cracking as he spoke. Then she appeared. He hesitated for a moment before continuing, his voice barely above a whisper. I was weak, Lorena. I made a terrible mistake, and I've regretted it every day since. Lorena felt a knot form in her throat as she listened to Daniel's words. The weight of imagining him with another woman suffocated her like an anchor. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run away and never look back, but at the same time, she knew she needed to face the truth and find a way to forgive him and move on with her life. Daniel, she murmured, her voice breaking as the tears she could no longer contain streamed down her face. I know I need to forgive you, but it's so hard for me. I need time to process all of this. I just hope that someday we can find a way to overcome this together. In that moment, Daniel felt a deep sense of injustice for everything he had endured in the past few years. Determined to clarify the facts, he began to tell his side of the story. Daniel described how, after Lorena left for her exchange in Japan, he threw himself into his final exams at medical school. Every free moment was spent buried in books, preparing for the future they had once dreamed of together. One day, exhausted after a long day at university, he ran into Estella, an old childhood friend who was also a classmate. It had only been a few weeks since Lorena had started her exchange on the other side of the world. Estella was one of the most popular girls on campus, the heiress of the richest family in the city. When she saw Daniel, she offered to give him a ride home, and he accepted, suspecting nothing. After all, Estella had always been a friend, and he never imagined that her kindness concealed a sinister motive. On the way, Estella stopped at a gas station to refuel. She went into the convenience store to pay, and when she returned, she offered Daniel a bottle of beer. Daniel, tired from a day full of studying and wanting to relax, Daniel's hand trembled as he recounted the night that had changed his life forever, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own sobs. "If only I had thought twice before taking that drink," he began, his tone thick with regret. The next moments of his story unraveled with a tragic weight, each word laden with the consequences of that single, unthinking gesture. After taking a few sips of the beer Estella had given him, Daniel began to feel something was terribly wrong. His legs grew heavy, his vision blurred, and a sense of impending dread washed over him. He tried to fight the growing suspicion that he had been drugged, but it was already too late. Estella drove him to a motel, where she drugged him again, leaving him unconscious and vulnerable. When Daniel paused, tears streamed down his face. His voice choked with the pain of reliving the events that had shattered his life. "If I could turn back time, Lorena," Daniel continued, his voice shaking, "I would have done everything differently. I would have followed you to Japan. I accepted that beer without realizing the devastating impact it would have on my life." He swallowed hard, struggling to piece together the fragmented memories that still haunted him. After that, everything became a blur. My mind was filled with confusing, disjointed flashes that made no sense at all. Daniel then described the horrifying moment he awoke the next morning in an unfamiliar room. A searing pain coursed through his body, and an overwhelming sense of shame washed over him. As he turned his head, he saw Estella lying beside him, a sinister smile playing on her lips. His stomach churned as she began to speak, her words dripping with malice and cruelty. "I really enjoyed our night together, Daniel," she said casually, as if discussing the weather. "I think Lorena will enjoy it too when she sees our little video." The ground seemed to disappear beneath Daniel's feet as Estella mentioned the video. His horror deepened when she showed him the footage she had recorded, capturing him in a drugged, disoriented state, utterly defenseless against her manipulative tactics. It was then that Daniel fully grasped the gravity of the situation. He had been used, trapped in a web of deceit spun by someone he once trusted. As Daniel spoke, Lorena listened in stunned silence, the horror of what he was sharing evident on her face. She had never imagined something so terrible could happen, nor that anyone could be so cruel and inhuman. "Daniel, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with tears as she looked at him with deep compassion. Daniel continued, describing how he was paralyzed with fear, struggling to comprehend the motive behind Estella's monstrous actions. Estella revealed that she had spiked his drink and recorded their encounter, knowing that no one would believe him if he tried to report her. She coldly assured him that the video would be proof that he had enjoyed their time together, a cruel manipulation that left him feeling trapped and powerless. The despair that consumed Daniel in the aftermath was overwhelming. He fled the motel, his mind reeling from the betrayal by someone he had once considered a friend. That night, he cried until dawn, unable to find a way to cope with the magnitude of what had been done to him. The cruelty of Estella's actions left a deep scar, one that would take years to heal, if it ever did. As Daniel recounted these painful memories, he fought back tears, his voice trembling with the raw emotion of reliving that terrible night. He felt as though he was still trapped in a nightmare from which he could never awaken, his mind spinning as he was pulled back into the horror of what had happened. He was powerless against Estella's cruelty, and the weight of how she had manipulated and destroyed everything he held dear in mere moments crushed him. Lorena listened, her heart torn between anger and compassion. The rage she felt toward Estella burned within her, hotter and more intense than anything she had ever experienced. The thought that someone could inflict such suffering on another human being sickened her to the core. She had never hated anyone as much as she hated Estella in that moment. Daniel then revealed that he had decided not to go to the police, fearing the power and influence of Estella's family in the city. He wanted to forget the incident and focus on his studies, but it wasn't long before Estella called with news that struck him like a devastating blow. She was pregnant. The news came just as Daniel learned that his father, the only family he had left, was gravely ill. The weight of these two events forced him to abandon his medical studies, even though he was on the brink of graduation. His father's illness became a cruel battle against an unforgiving disease, casting a dark shadow over Daniel's life and extinguishing any hope he had left. He was thrust into a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, struggling to cope with the pain of his past while facing the inevitable decline of his father. In the months that followed, his father's health deteriorated rapidly, each day a painful reminder of the inescapable march of death. Daniel found himself torn between the hospital and home, desperate to spend every precious moment with his father before it was too late. And then, one day, his father was gone, leaving Daniel utterly desolate and alone to face the harsh reality of his new life. The loss of his father was a profound blow, leaving him adrift in a sea of sorrow and despair, a wound that seemed as though it would never heal. Lorena listened in silence, her heart aching as Daniel's pain echoed within her own soul. She tried to imagine the agony he had endured over the years, the weight of each hardship pressing down on him. Lorena longed to comfort him, to ease his suffering, but she knew there were no words that could truly heal a heart shattered by the loss of a father. Daniel had already been crushed by grief during the funeral when Estella made a sudden appearance, casting an even darker shadow over an already sorrowful day. She called him aside, her presence like a dagger twisting in his wounded heart. Without wasting time, Estella began to threaten him, her voice a venomous whisper as she spoke of the consequences he would face if he didn't acknowledge their relationship. She warned that soon her pregnancy would be the talk of the town, and if he didn't want to face a scandal, he had better accept her proposal. "You know what's best for you, Daniel," she said coldly, her eyes devoid of warmth. "You have a simple choice. Take responsibility for our child and live a happy life with me, or face the consequences of your actions." Daniel felt cornered, trapped by Estella's cruel words. He knew her wealthy family wouldn't hesitate to use their influence against him if he didn't comply with her demands. With no other option, he reluctantly agreed, choosing to live a life built on lies and deceit to protect his future. Months passed, and Estella gave birth to a beautiful baby boy named Caio. They moved into a luxurious apartment in the heart of the city, owned by Estella's father. Yet behind the facade of happiness, a growing darkness threatened to consume them both. A year after Caio's birth, Estella abruptly left, abandoning Daniel and their son. She left behind only a brief note, saying she could no longer bear living with him and deserved to be happy. Daniel was devastated, watching his life crumble around him as he struggled to comprehend what had happened. When he sought out Estella's parents for support, he was met with cold indifference. They cruelly dismissed Caio as a bastard of a disgraced daughter who had disappeared without a trace. Estella's father went so far as to call their relationship a shameful embarrassment and warned Daniel never to contact them again. Left feeling utterly alone and abandoned, Daniel's life had become a ruin of broken promises and shattered dreams. Yet, despite the overwhelming despair, he knew he had to keep moving forward to find a way to survive for the sake of his son. With that determination burning in his chest, he began to chart a new path, one of redemption and hope, where he could finally find the peace he so desperately sought. However, nothing went as planned. With no family after his father's death and thrown out of the luxurious apartment by Estella's parents, Daniel found himself homeless, cradling a baby in his arms with nowhere to turn. He had since been scraping by, surviving between the streets and city shelters, struggling to provide for Caio as the boy grew older. Daniel's story deeply affected Lorena, who realized how much she had been deceived by the opinions of her mother, who had never supported her relationship with Daniel. Her mother's words now echoed in her mind, revealing the terrible consequences of the influence she had allowed to guide her past decisions. "I'm so sorry you had to go through all this," Lorena said, her voice trembling with emotion, her eyes filled with regret. "I wish I had been there to support you, but I'm here now, and I'm not going to leave you." She moved closer to Daniel, wrapping him in a comforting embrace, trying to offer the solace he so desperately needed. The realization that she had been manipulated by her mother gave Lorena a new perspective on their situation. She understood that she had let others' opinions dictate her choices, ignoring her own feelings and intuition. Determined to make amends, Lorena resolved to correct the mistakes of the past and build a future with Daniel. Daniel looked at Lorena, his eyes shining with gratitude and love. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he was thankful to have Lorena by his side as they faced an uncertain future together. "Thank you, Lorena. This means more to me than you'll ever know." And so, sitting on that park bench, they began to rebuild what had been broken, united by their love and the determination not to let anything tear them apart again. Lorena then made a decision. She would follow her heart and spend the first days of her vacation in Brazil with Daniel, renting a small place where they could start to heal and plan their future together. Lorena decided to rent a quaint countryside house where she and Daniel, along with his son Caio, could spend some peaceful days together. During this time, she focused on rebuilding trust, creating a safe haven where Daniel could feel secure, and where they could nurture the bond that had been wounded by the past. Every moment they shared became an opportunity to heal and strengthen their connection, laying the groundwork for a future filled with love and hope. Lorena was determined to prove to Daniel, and to herself, that they deserved a second chance, far removed from the toxic influences that had once torn them apart. A week before returning to the city, they made an important decision to officially start dating again. Though their reunion was recent, they both recognized the depth of their feelings and the importance of being together. Lorena promised that when they married, they would have a beautiful, albeit simple, celebration, a ceremony that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. In addition, Lorena decided to take a significant step forward by adopting Caio, formalizing the bond she had developed with the child. She knew that this was a crucial stage in solidifying the new family they were creating together. This gesture of love and commitment was something she was more than willing to make. Upon their return from the trip, Lorena and Daniel soon rented a small house in the city. With that settled, Lorena knew it was time to finally confront her mother, Dona Esther. Over the past few weeks, since Lorena's flight had landed from Japan, Dona Esther had been relentlessly trying to reach her, desperate for contact. However, Lorena had neither responded nor visited the family home. She knew she needed to face her mother and reveal all that she had discovered, as well as communicate her decision to marry Daniel. Although she anticipated a difficult conversation, Lorena was resolute in her determination to face the truth and move forward with her life. When she arrived, she found Dona Esther visibly agitated, sobbing and shouting as she attempted to justify her actions with empty words of regret. "Everything I did was out of love for you, Lorena, and you have the nerve to come back from Japan and not even visit home," her mother repeated, her voice thick with desperation. Lorena looked at her mother with unwavering firmness, her own words ringing with determination. "Mom, you had no right to influence me the way you did. You convinced me to leave Daniel for that exchange program, and it almost ruined his life," Lorena said, her voice steady and resolute. "He and I are a family now, and we always will be. I can't let your manipulations and lies control my future anymore." For Dona Esther, this was a painful moment, filled with intense emotions and hard truths that were difficult to accept. On the other hand, Lorena knew it was time to break away from the toxic past that her mother represented and move forward, building a life based on love and honesty. The visit to her mother's house was tense, but Lorena remained firm. Dona Esther refused to accept her daughter's decision, insisting that she was making a grave mistake by taking responsibility for another woman's child. Her arguments echoed through the small living room, laden with disapproval and concern. "You'll regret this, girl. Save your life before it's too late," she repeated over and over. Lorena, however, was steadfast in her resolve to forge ahead with her new family. She looked into her mother's eyes, her gaze reflecting the strength of her conviction. "I'm not going to abandon Daniel and my son," she declared firmly, her voice filled with determination. "They aren't to blame for the circumstances, and they deserve a chance to be happy." As the argument continued, Lorena remained unshaken. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and that she would face criticism and judgment, but she was prepared to endure it all for the sake of her new family. By the end of the conversation, as she bid farewell to Dona Esther, Lorena felt a mix of sadness and relief. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew she was doing the right thing by protecting Daniel. With this certainty warming her heart, she returned to the rented house with Daniel, ready to face the future with courage and determination. A few days later, while shopping in the city to furnish their new home, Lorena unexpectedly ran into Estella at a department store. The moment Estella noticed Lorena's presence, she couldn't resist making a provocative remark. "So, you've come back to the city, even after losing your handsome boyfriend?" she taunted. Despite the anger that boiled inside her, Lorena managed to control herself, maintaining a composed demeanor. She locked eyes with Estella, her gaze unwavering, and spoke with a firm and resolute tone. "I wanted to destroy you, but I won't dirty my hands. One day, you will pay for everything you've done. Daniel and his son are my family now." Estella attempted to laugh off the threat, but something in Lorena's determined stance made her realize that this was no idle warning. The intensity in Lorena's eyes sent a shiver down Estella's spine, making her realize that her past might indeed come back to haunt her. Without another word, Lorena turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Estella standing there, stunned and unsettled by the force of her words. For a fleeting moment, Estella felt the weight of her past actions looming over her like a dark shadow of guilt and fear, a reminder that her reckoning might be near. Lorena, on the other hand, continued on her way, head held high, confident that she had done the right thing by not lowering herself to Estella's level. She vowed to herself that justice would be served, even if it took time. She was certain that one day, Estella would face the consequences of her crimes. A month later, as Lorena and Daniel were beginning to stabilize their lives in their new home, they received the news that Estella had been arrested. She had been charged with trafficking illicit substances, as well as drugging and blackmailing her victims with recordings of intimate moments. The news brought a mixture of relief and happiness, along with a deep sense of justice for the couple, who still bore emotional scars from Estella's actions. Determined to start their lives anew, Lorena and Daniel made a bold decision: to move to another country with their son. They chose to live in Japan, where Lorena had spent 2 years and grown accustomed to the culture. This move was seen as an opportunity to leave behind all the painful memories of the past and embrace a future in a completely new environment. The first few months of adaptation to their new country were not easy. They encountered challenges and obstacles along the way, but their determination to rebuild their lives kept them united and resilient. Together, they faced each hurdle with courage and determination, knowing that better days were ahead. Far from the painful memories of the past and the people who had tried to harm them, Lorena and Daniel found a more welcoming and secure environment to raise Kaio and build a new life together. They discovered new opportunities and horizons, embracing each moment as a chance for growth and renewal. As they settled into their new home, Lorena and Daniel felt a sense of peace and hope growing in their hearts. They looked to the future with optimism, confident that they were ready to face whatever life had in store for them, together. A year after moving to Japan, Lorena and Daniel decided to celebrate their union in a small chapel in the city where they lived. The ceremony was simple but full of meaning, attended by the new friends they had made over time, as well as Lorena's old exchange companions. The decorations were modest but charming, reflecting the simplicity and true love they shared. The most touching moment of the ceremony was when Kaio, with a shy but proud smile, brought the rings. It was as if this simple gesture symbolized not just the union of Lorena and Daniel symbolized not just their marriage, but the formation of a new family built on the solid foundations of love, trust, and mutual commitment. Lorena was radiant in her wedding dress, her face glowing with happiness as she looked at Daniel with tenderness, fully aware that they were about to embark on an exciting journey together, ready to share the joys and challenges of life side by side. As Daniel gazed at her, he was overwhelmed with a deep sense of gratitude and love, knowing that he had found his soulmate in Lorena, a woman who loved him unconditionally and was willing to walk with him through all of life's ups and downs, even when fate had tried to tear them apart. In that moment, Daniel understood that all the suffering he had endured was worth it. As Lorena and Daniel exchanged vows of eternal love, the small chapel was filled with joy and hope. It was a moment of profound connection, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the life of their family. Walking out of the chapel as husband and wife, Lorena and Daniel felt blessed to have found each other. They continued to build their life together in Japan, far from the people who had once tried to harm them, dedicating themselves to creating a safe and loving environment for their son. The distance and time allowed them to heal, and they finally found the peace they had long sought. Lorena often reflected on the path that had led them to this point. In one of those moments of introspection, she asked Daniel, "Do you think that when we're destined to be with someone, nothing can keep us apart?" Her question resonated with the journey they had undertaken to find each other again, reinforcing their belief that true love can overcome any obstacle. Together, Lorena and Daniel discovered that happiness lay in the simplicity of shared moments and the strength of the love that bound them. Walking hand in hand toward the future, they felt grateful for having uncovered the true meaning of love, a love that strengthened them and inspired them to live each day with passion and purpose. With that love as their guiding light, they were ready to face any challenge the future might bring, confident that as long as they were together, they could overcome anything. Did you enjoy the story? Our channel is grateful for your company. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and comment below on what you thought of the story. Until next time, and